again on the economic issues which may be or may not be included in a constitution. Yesterday, I spoke about the various forms where it is, how it is being done, and also about those constitutions who don't give a general advice in this direction. I said at the end of the talk yesterday that I would start with expropriation and nationalization. I had received a question from one of the participants, and I will go in further details in this respect. Thereafter, I will deal with state-owned industry versus privately owned industry. Then I will deal with the question of monopolies. Finally, also go into the control of the industry, direct or indirect, the question to certain branches of the industry, and finally, since this is connected with industry, the question of the freedom of education. Perhaps what I'm not going to touch upon, I don't feel sufficiently specialized in this respect. I will not go into taxes, although I will mention the one or the other element, but I will also speak about subsidization. I believe that is quite something to work, quite some substance, which is should keep us busy for the following hours or minutes. First of all, expropriation. As I said, expropriation is possible, although the protection of the private property is common, and you can, from the point of international law, consider the protection of private property as a part of customary international law. But as I said, expropriation of private property is possible under three conditions. First condition, there must be a public interest for the expropriation. Now, this sounds very simple and very reasonable, but it is not so. And in practice, you see a lot of differences and problems in that respect. I will also go in this context into the protection of investment and into investment arbitration. I just finished one case or two cases on investment arbitration. What is public interest? Public interest means the private property can be taken if there is an interest of the public in taking this property. Sounds very simple. Give you one case, which I had to decide myself. It is a case which was deliberated before an administrative court, and the case was as follows. There was a farmer. He had, his farm was on the right side of the street, whereas most of the meadows and fields were on the left side of the street. There was an intention of the county to broaden the street, which had in the moment 2 lanes, and it should have 4 lanes. And it was also the project that these 4 lanes could not be crossed. In effect, it was impossible for the farmer to work on his fields with all his machinery. Is that expropriation? The freedom of property means to hold property, to make use of it, to use it economically, etc. The farmer not being able to use the property properly was clearly expropriated. It was one of the classical fields. I come to others which are less classical. Next point is, was there a public interest? How do you prove there is a public interest to broaden a street from 2 to 4 lanes? I should have added, this was in the middle of nowhere in Schleswig-Holstein. The administration argued, we have checked the traffic, and we have calculated the traffic, and at this point, there was so much traffic and the street is too narrow. First, what we had to do as a court to check where did they take their evidence. Was it along the whole street, or was it some other street which left before this street in question reached the land of the farmer? And what was so strange, that the street in question ended at the Schlei, that's a river in Schleswig-Holstein, and there was only a very small ferry, and this ferry could accommodate only 3 cars at the same time. If you count 40 cars per hour, where do these cars go? It was very clear that the cars, if that was a proper counting, would have left before would have reached the farmer's land. And therefore, the court decided the administration did not provide sufficient evidence that there was a public interest in broadening the street as anticipated. The administration went into appeal, and before the appeal court, it was established that they didn't want to broaden the street for the reason of the traffic, but they wanted to broaden the street for military purposes. They wanted to make this a road for tanks. And they wanted to have not disclose this particular element, for if you expropriate under the German system, for military purposes, the compensation is higher. They wanted to save money. Before the Court of Appeal, where they disclosed that this was a military purpose, they reached an agreement, and the compensation the farmer received was much more significant, and he was satisfied. You see, I told you this case quite in detail, it's many years ago, to show you that expropriation, even such a clear-cut expropriation, may face certain problems. But it can be even more complicated. There was a case, and I will not name, this is a more recent case and an international case, and therefore it was decided by an investment arbitration. Here, the issue was that somebody wanted to make economic use of a huge iron ore deposit in a foreign country, doesn't matter which country. He had the license. He had also the expertise, and he had invested quite a lot of money. When the business started economically, this investor was put into prison. Allegedly, he had not informed the financial administration that he had invested into this business $3 million. It later was found out that the information had been given, and the copies of the relevant checks were with the administration. What was the reason? This new iron production, which was meant to become a steel production, was a competition to the iron industry owned by the son of the president of that country. Is that enough to justify public interest? You would agree with me, it is not. But I wanted, sure, it's a presidential family, but the presidential family is not the one of public interest. You can do expropriation only if the interests of the state are concerned. You need space for a street, you need space for the railway or whatsoever, but you can't expropriate for private interests, namely, even if these are persons who have an influence in the country. But this happens very, very, very frequently. That expropriation is being undertaken not for the benefit of the state, but to avoid competition, to give an extra to somebody of the family of a high-ranking politician whatsoever. You can flag that as corruption if you want, but that's not my point. But is that really expropriation? The owner of this license still had the license. And the license had a certain pecuniary value, and this license was still valid. Therefore, back to the question, what is expropriation? Is expropriation also when the owner and designer of a certain activity can't act, for he has been sentenced for 3 or 4 years for hard labor, being in prison? This is very doubtful. We have no such cases, not so many cases where this has been done. And the respondent argued this is not expropriation. The arbitral tribunal said it is indirect expropriation, for the owner of the property concerned cannot make use of his property as anticipated and for which he did his investment. Have you any problem with this case? Seems not. Okay, then I'll continue. Then if you have expropriation, there you have a right for prompt compensation. When under Allende, the copper industry was nationalized, I explain the word a little bit later, then there was no compensation being anticipated from the side of Chile, and later it was stretched over many, many years. This is not prompt, and therefore what Chile had done at that time was illegal under the international law standards. And the compensation has to be a full compensation, others say an adequate compensation. The difference is significant. Let's assume that we had what happened in Germany, that you are having a nuclear power plant. Well, the nuclear power plant is meant to work and produce profit for 30 years. Now, it is, for environmental reasons, shut down. I'll come to that again. Do you have the right to receive full compensation? Although your investment, your return in investment, which you have calculated for 30 years, has already been accomplished for 25 years. Only 1/6 is missing. Shouldn't there be the question of a reduction of the compensation on that basis? The answer is yes. Also, it is possible to take into account how the industry in question is working. Is it profitable, or is it less profitable, or is it the contrary to profitable? Therefore, bankrupt industry or industry nearly bankrupt will receive less compensation than others. What should go into compensation? Sure, the machinery, the houses, the piece of land, etc. But this is not enough. The value of industry depends very often, depending on the various forms of industry, on the extent this industry is recognized and appreciated in the market or the economic system. For example, VW, expropriated, would have to take into consideration not only the land, the resources, the metal, and whatsoever, the cars which are ready or nearly ready, but also the amount or the extent to which VW is part of the car market. And if you come to the calculation, this car market involvement will be the most significant part. The goodwill, we call it, it depends on how many customers you have, etc. Therefore, the calculation of what has to be compensated for is quite significant, quite complicated. Now, I mentioned the word nationalization, and that was the word which also Allende used. He wanted to expropriate the copper industry, or copper, as far as I remember, since he believed that the mining industry should be state-owned. This is a view which has been taken by developing countries in certain periods quite intensively. And in this case, it was argued that in such a situation, no compensation should be paid. For the nationalization was meant to render the state concerned sovereign. A sovereign state should be sovereign in respect of the uses of its mineral resources. That's particularly the argument voiced by African developing countries. Chile is not a country which can rely on the principle of decolonization, for Chile is a sovereign country long before the First World War. It was economically a rich country in that period. But in cases like Gabon or Zimbabwe, this is a very important element. Now, is the search to become economically, so to speak, independent, is that a valid ground to expropriate? The developing countries argued that way, including Chile, Brazil, and whomsoever. But this principle, as they formulated in the demands for a new economic order, has not been accepted at the bitter end, for two reasons. First, the industrialized world was not willing to accept that. Second, they expropriated the products of these countries who did the nationalization. With two very famous cases, both decided in Germany. This is a case concerning Indonesia on tobacco, and another case on copper from Chile. Chile copper case, and the other, the tobacco case. In both cases, it was decided at the end of the, I should explain, what has been done was that the former owners of the copper industry, or the former owner of the tobacco growing in Indonesia, confiscated or brought a case against products out of these countries to claim their compensations they didn't receive. The whole thing ended up in a huge disaster economically for these countries. And today, nationalization is used as a word, but it's also accepted that an adequate, at least, compensation is to be paid. My hesitation has a ground. But the ground is that there is a necessity to look into how the former owners acquired the license or the ownership. In Chile, that was very simple. Connecticut Copper had a license from the Chilean government. I had to pay license fees, etc. That was not a big deal. However, the establishment of a tobacco plantation in Indonesia was something totally different. This was being done with the colonial methods, to say it very diplomatically. And for that reason, this was a fraudulent or even criminal acquisition of property. And therefore, you had to decide these things differently. I touched upon that already in my last, yesterday. But you can have that problem also in a different form, namely a case in which I was involved. This was a case, again, I will not name the names, for the case is very fresh. Of industry invested money in one European country to purchase certain agricultural products. So far, it's a clear-cut investment, and so on. All of a sudden, it was established that the money, which was altogether 360 million, which were invested, was, so to speak, in a fraudulent way, taken away by one partner of this industry. This partner of the industry was meant to face trial, but the government of that state was slow in investigating, was slow in bringing the issue up before court, and at the end, nothing really happened. What I'm saying factually, this was the argument put forward by the claimant. The response of the respondent was that this money, which had been invested, was gained in a fraudulent manner, what we would traditionally call money laundering. Now, how do you deal with investments which allegedly are the result of money or part of a money laundering system? First of all, if a state does not look into the criminal act which cheated and took away the funds which I have mentioned, is that expropriation? One can have doubts about that. at least it's a violation of the rules on investment. Let's put it this way, and therefore it is, or may be, depending on the situation, apart from a crime against private property. At least the private property is gone. Fine. But does an investment which comes out of fraudulent money, does that deserve the protection of the freedom of property or right to property? If you are a criminal and you shoot your neighbor, the pistol you have been using will be confiscated. Do you get compensation for that? No, you don't. For this is a means of a crime, and means of crimes can be confiscated without compensation. If you have a dog which is very ill and a danger for the public, this dog can or has to be killed. Do you get compensation? Sure, it's the dog is killed for the safety of the population, perhaps, but it is, you are the owner of a dangerous property, and therefore you should kill the dog yourself, and therefore you don't get compensation. You see, the question of expropriation has its particular niceties, let me put it that way, and I believe I gave you enough examples to show that the right to property is not absolute. There are certain case-developed instances where property can be expropriated and no compensation being paid. We have, in the moment, a pending case, Vattenfall against Germany. The Vattenfall's industry for the production of energy in Hamburg was not working anymore profitable since the environmental rules in Hamburg had been changed. Is this the implementation of rules protecting the environment? Is this expropriation? I won't say a word about that since the case is pending, but you can think about it. And finally, the last case, those of you who are smoking cigarettes, you have perhaps realized over the last 10 years that the packages of cigarettes have changed. And in some countries, particularly in Australia, they're particularly ugly, and they all have the inscription, "Smoking is a risk to life." This is a design through which you produce or promote your property. This design has been abolished. Is this expropriation? International arbitral tribunals have said, no, it is not. I leave it as it is for you. But you will agree with me that the question of how the economy of a given state is to be seen very much depends upon the right to property. Is it a right to property? How easily can it be challenged? What are the rules on expropriation? And what are the rules on using the profit out of this property? These are elements which establish more clearly than anything else the rules governing the economy in a particular state. I hope I made my point very clear, and I will now switch to another element, which is perhaps even more complex. There is a question, as I indicated right at the beginning, is the industry or economic activity which is state-owned. And I will come to the other side, to controlled by the government, which are typically state-owned industry. I follow the German system. The railways, most of the railways, I should say, is state-owned. What does that mean? Does that exclude that there are privately owned trains? No, it doesn't mean. If you come to Germany, you will see that there are privately owned trains and connections, mostly for the regional or the local connections. But they use the path of the traditional railway system. This is, however, state-owned. How come that the private owner can use this publicly owned railway system? The solution in Germany is that the private owner has to pay something to the state for that. There are other systems. In the United States, the whole railway system is private. Let me go to the aviation. Many of the air traffic systems are state-owned. Some, however, are privately owned. The majority is privately owned, but some are very much state-controlled. Now, what is the relationship between, let's say, Lufthansa, a private entity, a stock market, vis-a-vis another airline, let's say Aeroflot, which is state-owned? Would Lufthansa be discriminated, or is it possible to discriminate Lufthansa against Aeroflot when landing in Moscow or St. Petersburg? It's a good question. De facto, there will be differences, but it is very often so that these discriminations or affirmative action for the state-owned system is rather subtle, and there's very little complaint about that. For example, every stop in a particular airport, you have to have a license for that, and you have to pay fees for that. They're quite significant. But these fees are less for the state-owned, at least in the countries such as Russia, where the Aeroflot is state-owned. But let me go to a more complicated system. Who is the owner of the mass media? Is the TV private, or is it TV state-owned, or is it TV state-controlled? In Germany, the TV is state-controlled or even state-owned. And therefore, the government levies the fees which we all have to pay to have access to the lousy program for ARD and ZDF. But apart from that, there are private channels, and these private channels finance themselves by advertising. But if you compare this state-controlled channel with a private channel, you find in both advertising, and the industry pays heavily for that. Therefore, we have now a plan to prohibit for the state-controlled TV, which is living on fees, to also get benefits from the industry. There is already a certain amount of certain cut off you see less commercials on the state-controlled TV than on the private TV. But here we have the question of discrimination between public owned or public controlled and private things. But this is still not the real problem. The real problem is something else. I'll start with the most drastic. In Germany, the private use of water, the access to drinking water and water for sanitary purposes, is mostly public owned, not the federal government, but mostly the municipalities. This is interesting and is an issue which is regarded as appropriate in Germany for the reason that one doesn't want in Germany to have these services in the hand of private people. If you want to privatize the services of water, I believe in Germany we are, like Lenin has said, we have never had a revolution, and if a German does a revolution, he first goes to the railway station and buys a ticket. This is a rather unfriendly remark, but he was right. But in this case, there would be an uproar in Germany. How is the situation in Chile? Who is controlling the water supply? Who is controlling the electricity supply? Is it a private company or a semi-private company, or is it something public? This is not a trivial question. If you are cut off from the water supply by a private entity, you can bring a claim against this private company before civil courts. And you get a judgment, if you're lucky, in 2 years. If you, however, are cut off by the public authority, then you invoke your human rights, which you can't invoke against another private person, and you get a provisional measure at the latest within 2 weeks. Therefore, the protection against kind of shortcuts in this respect is better if these entities are state-owned rather than they are privately owned. Now, let me render the system a little bit more complicated. Let's assume the village X and Y concludes a service agreement with a private provider for drinking water. Or to put it differently, the municipalities establish a private service holder, service industry for providing drinking water. Here you would argue, then your human rights won't work, for human rights cannot be directed against another private. You're wrong. And the jurisprudence of the Federal Constitutional Court, your basic rights can be used to protect your rights in the moment that the public authority is hiding behind a private contractor. This is quite relevant. The administration and organization of cemeteries is done that way. And therefore, this is a well-established system. Very often in Germany also, the gardening in the cemeteries, German cemeteries have a lot of gardening. Some villages say this has been done through us. Here, however, it has been said no. By the administrative courts, they have said what a private can do, own industry or entity can do, should not be taken over by the public authority. And what I believe is a problem for Chile, that in the realm of health and in the realm of schooling, there is a rather significant imbalance in respect of these services are rendered by private entities and not by the public authorities. That's a personal opinion on my side. You can object to that, but I believe this has nothing to do with what is more efficient. The protection of the individual against the public is much better developed than against the private ownership. To tell you a joke, if you want to consider it, then it's again in Mongolia. When I first came to Mongolia, I was asked to give a lecture on the economic system of Mongolia. And Mongolia, at that time, had no property in land. And the first question which was raised with me was, is it correct that the United States require Mongolia to privatize the grassland? Can they kick us out of WTO if we don't? The question was formulated in these words. The Mongolian counterpart spoke fluent German, so that's what he said. And he ended with a remark which I found a little bit offensive. And please answer this question as precisely as possible and don't try to evade the question. Later I learned that's a way of asking questions in Mongolia. They are quite direct. My answer was, no, nobody can force a state to privatize something. And therefore, the United States, who are very much in favor of privatization, and they have requested also from Germany privatization, which has been refused by Germany. US industry goes quite far in this respect. Therefore, what I wanted to say is the following. Industry or the production of goods or services can be privately owned, it can be state-owned, and it can be mixed. The balance where it goes privately owned, state-owned, or mixed also is determinative concerning the government, the economic management, the governance on the economics. The more the issues are state, the more you can influence the economic system. If you tend to the other side, the less you can influence. Having said that, there's a new element which is not in my outline, although I referred to it already. We have an increasing system of environmental restrictions. Are they expropriation? To put it this way, in the production of chemical material, was at the beginning, you could produce as much garbage and debris in the air as you wanted. I occasionally was in the Ruhr Valley at the 60s. When you walked there in white tennis shoes, these were totally black within half a day. And your color, my shirt is in the moment blue, but if I had a white color, was in 1 hour gray or black. The industry was forced to do something about that, and we have now a system of cleaning the fumes significantly. In some industry, in the steel production, more than 90% of the fumes are filtered away. Fine. That's quite expensive. Is this expropriation? It depends how you define property. Remember what I said yesterday? Property has a social component. Property, as says, according to the German system, bears with it a social responsibility. And that includes the responsibility towards the environment. Apart from that we have in Article 20A now a principle on the protection of the environment. But I advise to do such a clause into a future Chilean constitution. It makes life easier to restrict industrial production, which is harmful to the environment. Let's move to my third point. A free market system is put into jeopardy by monopoly. Therefore, if there are certain industry is monopolizing certain things, then there is no, at the end of the day, no free market, for the one who has a monopoly may control the whole market. If we had only one producer of cars, then there would be no competition. And at the end of the day, there would be only the price of the car, and it would depend very much only on the decision of that facility. Therefore, an element of a controlled market economy is a control or the hindrance for the development of monopolies. This is part and parcel of the German economic system, but it is equally part and parcel of the European system. We have as such an institution in Germany as well as in the European Union, and they control whether a fusion of certain industry would create a monopoly or not. This is one of the very standard elements to protect the market system against failures which are inherent to the market system. The United States has a very particular anti-monopoly system, and so does the European Union and the German system. Apart from that, industry and the production and the services are controlled from, that's my point number 4, from various points of view. I've already mentioned the protection of the environment, but there are also other strings. You purchase a glass of honey, and it says Bienenwachs, honey, Bienenhonig. That means honey from bees. What is inside the glass? It can be purely sugar. For Bienenhonig, it doesn't say much. It must say garantiert 100% hier reiner Bienenhonig, guaranteed 100% pure honey from bees. We have a very sophisticated system for the protection of the consumer. This is a swap over from the United States, and this is quite a rigid system which is in permanent development. If you, for example, purchase a glass of whatsoever, let's say jam to get away from honey, and it says 500 grams, it must be 500 grams and not only 350, and so on and so on. This is not so much controlled by the state, but by certain privately organized institutions for the protection of the consumer. It goes quite far, very much quite far, but this is the way how things are being done. But it goes a little bit overboard, or occasionally very much overboard. If you purchase hot coffee in a paper, a flask or whatsoever, under the US system, it must be written on that, a cup. This is a hot liquid. Beware of spilling it and putting it on your skin. You may be burned. Come on. This, if you don't do it, then this certain production is prohibited. The consumers are considered to be totally ignorant of the realities. Be it as it may, these are the limits. We have the protection of the environment, we have the protection of the consumer, and we have also, that is very particular for Germany, not so much for the United States, so the prohibition of having genetically modified something. This has also been said. Apart from that, now, a new development, you must indicate the amount of sugar contained, the amount of salt contained, the calories, and whatsoever. This is a hell of a system of control, which I believe makes life for the producers and the stores quite complicated. But you don't have to know the details. Consumer protection, protection of the environment, and other forms of protection against the monopoly are means through which the state influences the development of the development of the industry. Let me go to my point number 5. Part of the economic life is the question, what is the qualification you need to get a job in the economic life of a country? Here, Germany is a very rich country with restrictions. And again, I use the comparison between Germany and the United States. I will not deal with Chile for obvious reasons. Now, in former times, long time ago, we had a system where you had to be trained and pass examinations to become a hairdresser or a goldsmith or a carpenter or whatsoever. And you first serve as an apprentice, then you pass an examination, which is, by the way, tough. And then you can continue to be trained and pass another examination. I'll explain that on the system of roof topping. I have been working as a somebody who did roof topping, and therefore I have to delete something here. Okay, then otherwise I don't continue to see you. Now, this is a very complicated system. The training is being undertaken by the business system as such, and the examinations are done by the business. But this is done in self-administration. We have certain institutions, we call them Innung, that's for a particular craft, the Innung of the baker, or the Innung of the hairdresser, and the others is the institution for the craftsmanship. If you wanted, this goes back to the Middle Ages in Germany, but you will not believe me, the same system was well known in China under Kublai Khan. that is 1400, where only those who had the privilege by the emperor who could produce silk or porcelain or whatsoever, or pottery. Our trademarks on porcelain come from Kublai Khan. He invented that. When you buy a bowl from Meissen, extremely expensive, then you see the crossed swords on the lower side of Meissen. Therefore, this is an old tradition which doesn't exist in other countries. And the EU was against that system, saying this is barring the free access to the services, to the economy for others. In France, everybody can produce a baguette. In Germany, it has to be a baker who is trained. And therefore, a couple of years ago, roughly 15 years ago, many of these crafts lost that system. This was a big mistake. For these crafts system has the element that the training of the laborers for industry is being undertaken in this area. They train more than 75% of the German workforce. And therefore, the laborers working in industry are very well trained. And they train, again, people who are equally well trained. If you have in the United States a plumber and compare what he or she is doing with the plumber work in Germany, you see the difference very easily. Therefore, this is a system which is very typical for Germany, but it doesn't exist in other countries. But the present German government has made it one of the major export goods, namely the training for not the intellectual training, the training in craftsmanship is an element which is very important for the industry. And this is done by the industry itself. And this is being fostered by probably mostly by the lender, but also by the federal government. This is certainly an element which is promoting industry and the quality of industry. The system has been developed due to the fact that we have quite some parts of Germany which are extremely poor by nature. For example, I have been once in a village in Baden-Württemberg. That's in the middle of nowhere. This village produced perhaps wheat or barley or whatsoever. And in the 19th century, this village decided to emigrate, the complete village, to the United States, for they were starving. They had nothing but the growing of certain corn products, and that was not enough. Baden-Württemberg was traditionally one of the very poor parts of Germany, and that it is by now one of the richest parts, same Bavaria, has something to do with the alternatives and the population in the two regions have done. The Baden-Württemberg people first, particularly the people in Württemberg, and then the Bavarians. They have become inventors. They invent mechanical tools. And if you go through the German industrial landscape, you will find much industry, not too many employees, which produce certain things like screws, like particularly to have a screw in the wall, etc., etc. These Dübel, we call them. And this has rendered Baden-Württemberg a rich country, but it is a matter of fostering the innovation. Still, in the worldwide scale, Germany ranks as number 3 amongst innovation. And that is the reason why Germany was against, yes, publicizing the patent of biotech, the vaccine against the coronavirus. For the richness of Germany rests in its intellectual property in part. But to foster such a development is also an element of industry politics, and therefore an influence over the state into the industry. But coming to my last point, education. A good education is the basis for industrial development and for an economic well-being. In Germany, going to private school is cost-free. High school is cost-free. Universities is free. That is quite something. The universities, there was a certain movement to pay, to have moderate fees for being at university. This has been abolished again. It has been introduced only for 3 or 4 years, and that primary school is free for everybody and high school is free for everybody, including foreigners, is in Germany a must, period. Now coming to the university, and this is very decisive. Is it possible for the administration to limit access to studying medicine or certain physics or chemistry or whatsoever? For this is influence in your future in life. And which are the grounds under which you may be able to limit access to education? We have the freedom of education. It's Article 12 in the German Constitution. You must distinguish, however, between the freedom to choose an education and the freedom to make use of an education. That's not the same. You can choose what you study, but under today's system, there are certain limitations which are very often tailored to the capacity of the given university. To become a dentist, for example, is rather complicated. You need an exit exam from the high school, gymnasium. It's more than high school under the American system. It's high school American system plus the 2 junior college years. And you must have a final exam under mostly 1 or 1.1. Otherwise, you need certain other elements which would allow you to become a dentist. Is that permissible? Yes. For the state is not an obligation to permanently increase the chairs for dentists and the laboratories and whatever is needed to become a dentist. But when I say so, there is also an obligation of the state to foster the universities significantly. Therefore, it's a balance. There are many cases where people wanted to become whatsoever and couldn't, psychology, for example, and couldn't enter university due to the limitations. Let's not deny it. This is a possibility to steer, to a certain extent, the way in which the industry will have to go. If you cut down on the more social and abstract studies, then you increase on the more technical studies, you have focus on of fostering technical studies. In the moment, Germany is missing on electro engineers, and Germany is missing on people who very much engage in the artificial intelligence. Classes I've heard in Munich on artificial intelligence are now ranging by 1,000 students. Can you imagine that? Or everybody wants to get engaged therein, for this is a very promising and a new issue. I remember having been told by some of my colleagues from the Max Planck Society, when it came, it's the same run we had for people of physics when the computers came up. It's not that long ago. Then out of sudden there was a need for computer people. And here again, new programs were established. And this was it. Today we have faculties which very much concentrate on computer science. And they also concentrate to a certain extent on the artificial intelligence. Let me check. Let me summarize. Yesterday, we spoke about those more general remarks or principles concerning the industry or the economy of a state. There's either nothing or the reference to market economy or the planned economy or whatsoever. Traditionally, in classes, we emphasize that. But I wanted to show you today, and I did that in a rather condensed form, that these are not the tools how to direct the economy. The economy is directed and guided directly or indirectly by the training system, by the system of rendering and promoting new developments, innovations, protecting innovations, and by interpreting the private property guarantee either more from the perspective of its social responsibilities or the total freedom. There is a growing intervention into the economy due to protection of consumers, the environment, and other issues, which put in limitations for the free economic development. Only if you see this picture as a whole and never ever forget the element of training and education, then you get the real picture of what is the economy about, or the system of the economy about. And please do take into consideration, if you nationalize industry quickly and without caring what is thereafter, foreign investment will not come anymore. At the end, the state economy will suffer more than it did before. But that's a personal view. You may look upon that differently. Finally, as I said at the beginning, I do not want to go into the taxation system. Taxation is for me a mystery, but in the moment, Germany, for example, in the German industry belongs to the most taxed industry in the world. The minimum tax we have for now, or will have soon, of 15% is a joke. Sure, Amazon, we can't tax it all, for Amazon claims that it doesn't produce in Germany or don't deliver, but that's another matter. I hope I gave you some ideas for thought and a little bit, some thoughts for a discussion. And if you're interested in the Chilean development, don't fall into the trap to believe that by designing the constitution, you can influence the industry in a way you want it to be. Thank you very much. Now I'm waiting for protests.
Well, thank you for your lecture. Protests and questions, everything is welcome. If you want to raise your hand, please.
What is happening? It was a bit complex, I agree.
Let's give everybody a minute to think about.
We have 45 minutes for discussion. Use it. Okay, go ahead.
Professor Wolfrum,
Yes.
do you listen to me?
Yeah, I hear you well.
Okay. Thank you so much for your class. Quite interesting. Back to the point from the Chilean case when you talk about the in German Eigentum. Huh? Okay. I think that the example what you give in the Chilean case, I think is quite it's a good case. But the question is, what do you think about the ownership from the natural resources? You know that we have a lot of problem with that kind of elements in the Chilean economy. I mean, the Chilean economy is quite simple. It's just about natural resources. That is the majority of the Chilean economy. So the question is, first, what do you think about the possibility to expropriation for this natural resources? I know it's quite difficult, in particular for water here in Chile is private, you know, so almost everything is private here in Chile. And the Chilean government, I mean the Chilean state, not the government, needs that money. The other thing you talk about was the social responsibility of the property. I mean, like in German, there's die Totalbindung des Eigentums. So in our constitution, I mean, the constitution for 1980, we have that concept in the constitution, but the reality is that it doesn't work, or it doesn't have work in this sentence. So in your opinion, what do you think is I don't know, the better way to see about the natural resources, not just in Chile, but particularly in Chile, but all in Latin America? I mean, the right to have to be the owner of this natural resources. Thank you.
Let me start with the private ownership. Natural resources I will do in another step. Private ownership, you have the social responsibility it was intentionally that I used Article 14 and the social component, for I know that in your constitution, in the present constitution, you have that. There's nothing wrong with this clause, as you can see in Germany, absolutely not, but it has never been implemented. Therefore, you can have the perfect constitution, but still have a very bad system. You know that I'm speaking from Sudan. They had, until recently, the constitution of 2005. And it was, if you care to read it, an interesting and a very open, human rights-minded constitution. It has a Bill of Rights, which was very elaborate, and even declared all human rights treaties to which Sudan had ratified as part and parcel of the Chilean system. And it could be invoked directly. You don't have that in Chile. And actually, I believe it's rather 2 or 3 countries who have such a clause. It was never implemented. It was a constitution and nothing. For you can kill the constitution, the best of the constitution, by not implementing it. In this case, in Chile, they did it particularly by making sure that the Constitutional Court had no cases. Access to the Constitutional Court was cut off, and that was it. Therefore, it was a wonderful constitution. You could show we have everything, and underneath you do what you want. Therefore, this is the message number 1. Don't rely alone on what is in the Constitution. Mind and mark the word alone. You have to have it. Such a clause like social responsibility. But you must also have the follow-up. Now, what is the follow-up for this clause? The follow-up is, or let me put it as such a clause makes it easier to limit private ownership. If you say it has a social responsibility, if you define the social responsibility, this is not expropriation. It is a definition of what is socially understood private property. Remember the dog I spoke about? It was a case, that's why I mentioned it. Killing a dog with rabies is a consequence of social ownership. If you have only ownership, then killing that dog may be an expropriation. Do you see the difference? Now, as far as natural resources are concerned, that's something totally different. And you're absolutely right to say, here the ownership is, under the Chilean system, the natural resources in the ground belong to the state of Chile. You have the system like the Brits and many other states, not like Germany. Not the owner of the land is the owner of the natural resources, but it is the state. I explained, I believe yesterday already a bit, that under both systems, they were diametrically opposed to each other, but under today's system, in both cases, for the exploration and exploitation of mineral resources, you need a license from the state. The license of what we would call in Germany, I don't have the term in Chile, the Oberbergamt. Since you speak German, you can translate it into Spanish.
Das Wort in Spanisch ist concesión.
Concession, but the institution is an agency of the government, and means Bergamt is an institution for the mountains.
Ja, hier in Chile, dieses Amt heißt Serna Geomin, das bedeutet Servicio Nacional de Geología y Minería.
Yeah, we see Bergamt is very traditional word, it's more ancient. Be it as it may, now what are the preconditions for this license? What must a state which is responsible for its resources make sure? I start with the obvious. A state who is responsible for its well-being of its citizens should take care that mining, this is prospecting, exploration, and exploitation, the 3 elements of mining, are not degrading the environment more than is reasonable or permissible, whatever you call that. That's an environmental factor. in this environmental factor, you have to also include the question, what is the consequence of mining on your water resources? Let's not forget, you are not rich in water in Chile. At least some parts of Chile are not rich in water, right? And you have industry which uses quite a lot of water. Particularly your vineyards use a lot of water. You see, I know Chile a bit, and I once owned a vineyard myself, therefore I know, but in Germany, that's not a particular problem, but in your case, it is a problem. Now, what do you have in mind additionally? If you follow the today's considerations, you should try to get to use the so-called sustainable development. What does that mean? Apart from the protection of the environment, it would mean that you don't take more copper, your mine resource, out of the mines than absolutely necessary. For future generations would like to also rely on copper, won't they? You should also develop a program for subsidizing copper. The industry on cabling, telephones, and so on doesn't need copper anymore, but we have these fiber lines, and therefore that is reducing the copper needs. Secondly, you should recycle so that you can make use of your natural resources as long as possible. Finally, you should try to find, apart from substitutes, places which are easier to mine. When I mean easier, with less negative impact on the environment. This is what you should do in the mining system when you distribute licenses. Or whether you do that to a Chilean company or to an American, Canadian, or Australian company. These are the companies in the field, I know. But you will perhaps forget one point. In this license agreement, you should write into the license that a certain percentage of the workers in the mines at all levels should be Chileans and should be properly trained. I'll give you an example to the contrary.
Sorry, Professor, it's a very good point, because I have a friend in Norway, and the Norwegian government, in the early 40s probably, and the 50s, they do that actually, and they prepare this, the Norwegian with the state's company, and they prepare the qualify his workers in this mining, for example, for oil.
I didn't want to give you a positive example. You can learn very much from Norway, I agree. But I wanted to give you a negative example to learn. And I know these mining contracts or licenses. In Mongolia, the contract, I will not mention the firm, for gold mining had no obligation to use workers from Mongolia, was exempt from taxes for 10 years, was exempt from delivering a portion of the gold to Mongolia. It was, to put it that way, 10 years free of any obligation whatsoever to do mining. You now would like to know why this agreement was reached? Or can you give you the answer yourself? I tell you, a certain amount, which was fairly limited, went to those who decided. There is often a corruption involved, but the elements I mentioned, which should go into a proper mining license or agreement, the form doesn't matter, it's very often called a license, but it is very often also a contract, should be clearly fixed, and the elements which are of relevance for the state concerned should be formulated and implemented and monitored. Okay. I can give you other mining agreements which did similar things. It's quite a frequent disaster. And then the question, nationalization or not, is not that relevant. For, you mentioned it yourself, even a Chilean entity would have to follow these principles. And they might not do that from alone.
Sorry, can you repeat that? I don't
Yes, even if you nationalize this industry, the same qualifications for a license should prevail.
Okay.
Therefore, nationalization only is harmful to the reputation of a state, not necessarily a better bargain. Okay?
Okay, thank you so much.
A long answer for a quick question.
Ja, es war auch eine große Frage jedenfalls. Dankeschön.
Bitte, bitte. Who else? Your name is not particularly Norwegian.
I didn't say I am Norwegian. I say a friend in Norway. Actually, I read a paper. There was like a comparison, in fact, between the mining history in Norway and in Chile. It's quite interesting paper.
You should also look into the oil and gas exploitation of Norway, which is
exactly, that was the point, actually.
This top quality worldwide.
Yes, yes it is.
Okay, further questions?
Here, hi, Professor. How would you address private property in a constitution? Talking about from the Chilean point of view, how should it be addressed? Like the protection of it.
As I said, you already have in the present constitution the guarantee of private property with a social component, stating that the property, having property has a social responsibility, an inherent social responsibility. For this gives you the possibility to further enact and specify that by a law. If you don't have it, it's much more complicated to have certain legislation.
Thank you.
You're welcome. To give you an example, if you have a catastrophe, the government may be interested to expropriate, if you have it, your truck. You can easier do it with such a clause, but without such a clause. The one is you pay compensation, the other one you don't. Dear colleagues, you are less talkative than last time. Even my Sudanese colleagues here raise more questions.
Okay, so I'm just gonna ask something. So is there any international law that we should consider in the process of this constitution regarding private property?
Okay, you limited it, but I will give you a broader answer. Constitution making is first and foremost the responsibility of the state concerned. And if you are looking into it, I'll give you some exceptions. There are very little elements from international law which you have to take into account. But there are some. Constitution making should follow or produce a constitution which follows the rule of law. There is in the moment the tendency within the United Nations that the rule of law is mandatory. You may disagree with that or not, but that's a trend. Rule of law means separation of powers, independence of judges, fair trial, and that individuals have mostly unlimited access to court, to put it this way, generally. But this is one element. Democracy is not considered, at least not by the majority of states, as a mandatory element under international law. However, if Chile would come with an undemocratic constitution, which I don't expect, there would be a wrinkling of eyebrows in the international community, which is bad for the image. However, what is democracy? There is one element in which the UN will insist, namely that there are periodic elections, and these elections are general, secret, and free. This is mandatory. Therefore, there should be a clause to that extent in the Constitution. And secondly, the Constitution, and now I switch over to the procedure, should also be adopted in a procedure which is democratic. But in your case, that's not a problem. You're a very democratic procedure, at least so far. Now, your constitution, constitutional assembly, you have a different word, I know, is directly elected from the population. It's great, that's how it should be. And this will have certain rules of procedure, will have its internal structure, which is not yet decided, but I can predict certain elements, and the outcome will have to go to a referendum. Now, the colleague who spoke before me yesterday and today was rather, let me say, hesitant about the legitimacy of the referendum. I share this view in part. I believe it is very good to have a referendum, but alone a referendum is not sufficient. Here we would agree. I believe there should be, to make a constitution really democracy founded, it should be open to the influence of the public during the constitution making process. I have only heard 50% of his speeches, therefore I don't know whether he mentioned that. The best example to that extent is what has been done in South Africa recently. But if you come to Germany, we neither had a referendum nor the participation of the public at all. And still we believe we have a very good constitution and a rather democratic constitution. There where I differ from him, I would say, to put it in classified, there is a procedural element for legitimacy, and there can be, it should be, a result-oriented element of legitimacy. even if the population is fully involved in the constitution, but that constitution promotes, let's say, a genocide, this constitution is not legitimate. Therefore, it's a result-oriented and it's a procedure. Don't believe, please, a right procedure brings you to a right result. This is the American view. And in the definition of the rule of law, we have to have the procedural element, and many parts in this world believe that's just it. But I would argue, and for Germany, I believe I'm right, or I'm sure I'm right, you also have to have the proper result. These two elements are very important. But the third element, a constitution as the one of Germany adopted in 1948 is now a little bit old. What you have to find procedures which establish the permanent legitimacy of a constitution. Here I disagree with my speaker, perhaps for at least I didn't hear that he mentioned that. How is this being done? This form of legitimacy, which is following the constitution, can be expressed in various forms, particularly in elections where a huge part of the population participates. If only 20% participate in elections, there's something wrong with the constitution or the culture which sustains the constitution. You will hear the same tomorrow, day after tomorrow, where I speak about that. Okay? But I believe this is an issue, at least the procedural element is also embedded in public international law. The other parts I will tell you on Thursday.
Thank you again.
Are there any other questions?
I have a question.
Good.
Yes, please.
First of all, thank you, Professor, for your intervention today, because you have touched on issues that are of special importance to me. My question is about natural resources. It's about Mexico. In Mexico, we find ourselves in a very serious and worrying situation because we are going through a situation of water stress. There is drought. The water is increasingly polluted, and Mexico has to supply the United States through a water treaty signed in 1944. So every so often time, we have to give millions of cubic meters of rivers that we share on the northern border. So the problem is that Mexico no longer has enough water and has had to start extracting it from dams in other states of the Republic. So this is to compete with the United States. My question is it possible to annul this treaty in some way in which Mexico is not sanctioned by the US power?
Okay, that's a complicated question, I must say. I would say the need for more water, you need for the reason that we have climate change. And the division of access to water resources as established in these treaties. I don't know these treaties, therefore I will be rather general, maybe not to your favor. Therefore, you might consider invoking the clausula rebus sic stantibus in international law, which you find in the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties as one element or mechanism, I should rather say, asking for a renegotiation of these treaties. But I tell you frankly, this is a typical answer of an academic. To ask for a renegotiation of treaties with the United States is a cumbersome issue and perhaps will not be very much liked, particularly since also California, Texas also have a lack of water. Although there is a difference, in the United States you have sufficient water resources in other parts of the country, whereas Mexico, as far as I remember, is rather limited in this respect. But what I also would consider as being helpful is, and you may not like this idea, I don't know Mexico very well. I would start in Mexico a huge program of reforestation. Planting forest trees, hold water in the ground, and you will not believe it, produce more rain. And that is what you definitely need. Sure, you have the problem that the rain is above the ocean due to the particularities of the cold stream in the Pacific. But nevertheless, reforestation is a significant element. Apart from that, what I could recommend to you, get in contact with Singapore. Directly after the Second World War, after the Japanese had left, Singapore had practically no access to water, to fresh water, I mean. Today, Singapore is approximately 85% self-relying. It is being done by a very intensive desalination program, by a very intensive recalibration or filtering of water which has already been used. It doesn't sound very funny, but it works. And Singapore, if you ever go there, is the greenest city I've ever come across. Lots of plants which keep the water, there is some rain, in the ground, and therefore, as I said, Singapore has a very good system of reproducing or producing water, taking water from the ocean. Sure, you then have the problem what to do with salt, but this can be taken care of. Therefore, we should not opt only for the renegotiation, which I would do on your case, but also try that. If you wish, I give you a further advice. You will consider me crazy, but you would not be the first one. The question is, every year, huge icebergs are leaving the Antarctic. The Antarctic has a huge shelf of ice. And although it is prohibited to do mining in Antarctic, there's a moratorium. Look into the protocol to the Antarctic Treaty. You can harvest floating ice. And there are plans to that extent, and they want to bring the ice to certain places such as Australia, where they have also a lack of ice. South Africa, the water current in the ocean is not in your favor, but think about that possibility. I might tell you, the quality of the water out of the Antarctic ice is absolutely superb. There is a firm developing this system somewhere in Australia. A little bit exotic plan, but nevertheless.
Thank you so much.
If there are no further questions, we should not squeeze you too much. Joe, what do you think? Should we stop at this point?
Yes, I think it would be a good moment to stop, and a good moment as well to tell everybody about some changes in our plans, in our program. We already heard that Professor Wolfrum is in Sudan at the moment, and he will have some meetings, some meetings that were not planned before or that came up with the government, and so he will have to miss the meetings, our workshop for tomorrow. He will be with us on Thursday again. So we wanted to tell you this, and I can tell you that I'm still working on the possibility to maybe get the possibility that one or two of the workshops that are held in the afternoon and in the evening could change and fill the gap in the morning. But I'm not ready with this. So I will tell you today, before we leave, I will tell you if there have been any changes, and I will send you the changes in the program.
I very much apologize to the audience, but there is a particularity in Sudan. Never is there any decision on time. Mostly a decision 5 minutes before the event or even later. Today I had to see three governors. I was told about that 10 minutes before I had to meet them. This is typical for Sudan. It's amusing, keeps you flexible, but is highly frustrating. And tomorrow I will have to meet 3 or 4 ministers, probably, hopefully, the meeting has been confirmed, but you never know. Also, the opposite may happen.
So thank you very much, Professor Wolfrum, for your lecture, for your workshop today. And well, good luck tomorrow with your meetings, and we see you on Thursday. To everybody in this group, we will meet after lunch again at 2:30. We will have the second part of our workshop about derechos de pueblos indígenas y gestión de recursos. So have a good break, and we will meet back here in this room. If you haven't had the chance to download the files Professor Croissant left here in the chat, you can do this right now, or we will upload them in our member area at const.de. So, well, if there's no question to Mr. Wolfrum and no question to me, then we could go to our lunch.
All the best for your lunch, and take the indigenous people seriously, please. I was for 12 years member of the Committee Against Racial Discrimination, which dealt with indigenous too.
Yes, we do. Yeah, many thanks to you, Mr. Wolfrum. Here in the chat, I just transmit to you that there are a lot of thanks to the professor.
Thank you. My pleasure. See you on Thursday.
See you on Thursday. Goodbye.